Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. My name is Dan Arsenault. With me is Robert Brooks, who is the finance professor at the University of Alabama for many years. And I've known him for many years, and it's my fault that he's just now getting on Church for Skeptics. It really is. But we're going to make better for that. So it's an interesting conversation about Christianity. How does that work with financial principles? And I think you're going to have an interesting conversation today. So I'm going to switch from Robert to Bob and say, what does Christianity have to do with finance?
It has a lot to do with finance. It's been my observation, having taught finance to a wide variety of people over many decades, that finance is a social science. It involves the human element, and so what it means to be human lies at the heart of understanding how to be good in managing your finances. And so depending on your worldview, the conclusions you come to and how you manage your money change drastically.
As you said, worldview, I noticed in our conversations prior to this, I think it's really cool, that your worldview starts your conversation kind of like you're starting how to do finances not from a monetary position or perspective, but mostly from a worldview perspective. So how does that connect?
Well, that's exactly right. So if the way we manage our money hinges on what we really think this life is all about. And for example, if I'm just an evolved creature, no different than my dog, how I manage my family's finances is drastically different than if I'm a divinely created being, created in the image of God, with a purpose and a meaning and a calling in my life. It changes. And so how you manage your day-to-day finances hinges deeply first on your worldview, because the way we see things, like a pair of glasses, financial ideas that come at us, many of them are eliminated at the worldview level long before we start even thinking through what they are.
All right. So make a connection then between the Christian worldview, which is, what you're talking about, made in the image of God, to how we approach taking care of our money.
Yeah. So if one of the things I'd love to study someday, but have yet to really been able to get a hold of the data, is many people believe physical illness causes financial distress, and in fact it does. But what people miss is that financial stress causes physical illness. And so the greatest humorist is the person that coined the phrase easy payments. There's nothing easy about those credit card payments. And so if I start out with the idea that I'm actually managing resources that have been sent my way by a loving creator, that's different than trying to make sure I hang on to resources that I somehow in my own power have acquired.
So it seems like to me you have a trust factor as a bottom line to handling your finance. I don't have to do this, or I don't have to do that. God does things that I can't.
Correct.
And I can do things that God instructs me to do. So I think that's awesome.
So one key attribute that I want to make sure that has made a world of difference in my own mind is the distinction between owner and manager.
Yeah.
Is that if my atheistic friends are correct, then I am an owner of my resources, and we're fighting over this fixed pie of goods on this rock called the earth, and we're just, if I can get more of it, I've taken it from you. That's one perspective. The other perspective is I'm managing the resources of a loving God who's created a very abundant earth. And so I believe by design we're better able to manage resources because we were created to manage them, I believe, as opposed to owning these resources.
All right. So now we're talking about Marxism, I
Yep.
think, and it's inevitable that we have these conversations or these questions. My first question is, and I know you don't want to answer it like this, and you can answer it however you want, but is capitalism a biblical worldview? And you're going to say probably not exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the problem in today's culture is words mean different things to different people.
Right.
For some people, if you say the word capitalist, they think of the absolute worst owner of a business, their worst experience, and the owner was desperately greedy, polluting the environment, doing these horrible things. So I like to reframe that just because we think
Sure.
perhaps these words they mean different things to different people. I'd like for you to think about a continuum from liberty to statism. And so statism, an example, would be communist China, where they basically manage everything from cradle to grave. The state is the ultimate, basically, and you're just a pawn in the state. You're just a product of the state, and you're useful only to the degree that you can add to the benefit of the state. Liberty,
The cog in the wheel.
yeah, you're a cog in the wheel, and if you're no longer functional, it's kind of scary to think about. But if you go to the other extreme of liberty, if you allow people to have freedom to choose their vocation, to choose whether they're going to work that second job, to choose how they're going to live their life, to me it's indisputable in the evidence that the more you can move towards liberty in a culture, the more human flourishing occurs. That the poorest of the poor are much better off if people have liberty as opposed to being state controlled.
I have a question in your experience, and this is kind of a China question, but I don't really know. In that cog as a wheel, I'm a cog in the wheel here, how does that come to fruition for older people in China or any other statist, system where they can't function anymore? Their cog's not doing what it's supposed to do. How do they take care of those people? Or do they?
So generically, rather than speaking to a specific country, if your worldview is that we're just animals and that once the animal reaches a certain point, that their cost of care exceeds the benefits that the state is receiving, that's a very dangerous place to be.
Sure.
And in many of those kind of cultures, what you'll observe is that grandparents go out of their way to be sure they're helping the grandchildren, because that keeps them productive. For see, if the grandparents are helping the grandchildren, then both parents can go work. And that makes that the value they're bringing in their sunset years, they're caring for the grandchildren so that the parents can be productive in the culture. That's very different than in countries where we still have some liberty, in that, particularly from a Christian perspective, the elderly, somebody who's 95 years old, has lost all their productive function, is still a divinely created being, worthy of honor and respect. And there are healthcare providers and skilled nursing facilities that still have that mindset. And because we care for some elderly in our families, it's amazing the difference in the skilled nursing facility where their view is you're simply an animal to be managed until you're dead, versus you're a divinely created being worthy of honor and respect even when nobody else is looking. Mm-hmm. And so I find the Christian worldview deeply appealing because I think it has the right perspective on what it means to be human.
I was at somebody's house yesterday, and they were caring for an elderly lady, and it's amazing to me that what she was about was just her presence. Mm-hmm. It was just her being there, and that's true with all of us, even if we have function or not. But she didn't have a lot of input as far as making the house a better person, except for her presence and her love and so forth, and relationship to those people. But that was huge. That was enough, at her level. Is wealth? You said this earlier. Mm-hmm. Explain is wealth a fixed pie that we have to fight over? And it seems to me that's what Marxism is.
Right.
is that you have to have the people have to have the means to own the production so that they can divide the pie.
Right. So it, again, wealth is one of those words that mean different things to different people.
Right.
To me, wealth is and will always be metaphysical.
You have to explain that.
It's not dollars in your bank account, which is now digits anyway, but it's not the number of houses that I own or whether I have a private jet. It is wisdom. One of the things I learned having helped launch a wealth management company in 2003 is it doesn't matter how much wealth the matriarch and patriarch of a family left the next generation. If the next generation was foolish, all of that wealth was gone within 3 to 5 years. So this mother and father built a business. They were highly successful. They sold the business for $20 million. They gave the money to the children. What they forgot to do was raise their children, in the fear of the Lord. That the children were very materialistic, and it doesn't matter how much money you give to somebody who's foolish; they're going to lose it all eventually.
Does that play into this question? I have some questions there we looked at. Financial ideas obviously have consequences, but do financial ideas have antecedents?
Yes, they absolutely do. And I think this is the secret of we've all heard that ideas have consequences, and they do. The idea that I can just go to college on borrowed money and go ahead and buy that new truck, and when I graduate from college, I'm going to go ahead and buy the $800,000 house with no money down. The idea that I'm going to somehow grow my income to pay all this off, that had an antecedent. In other words, before I even began that thought process, I had to have had a foundation, the set of glasses that I'm looking at life. And if all there is in this life is the little bit of what hedonism that I can extract out of it, a little bit of happiness, sort of the Hallmark movie, I just want you to be happy. If all there is, that antecedent leads to living beyond your means, whereas if the antecedent is, I've been created by a loving God. Now I'm sinful. I find within myself doing things I know I shouldn't do, but at the same time, there's a loving God, and He's given me the precious gift of managing His resources including my human capital. To me, one of the greatest wealth atoms that we have, particularly in free countries, is the human capital that we have. And if you learn a skill or a trade, or you use your God-given creativity to launch businesses, that human capital eventually gets translated into physical things that you own and manage on behalf of God and for His glory. And so to me, if you want to get out of financial bondage, if you're listening or watching this, and I've made you good and angry at this point, my challenge is if you change your perspective, if you consider the antecedent, what if the Bible really is true? And that what Jesus said about money and possessions and the deep biblical wisdom on wealth management found in the Proverbs will really benefit you. I would challenge you to find out what Jesus really did say about money.
And apparently Jesus said a lot about money.
He did. He said more about money and possessions than he did about heaven and hell. So he has a lot to say on that.
Can you, and this is kind of a surprise question, what some basic principles that Jesus talked about? And when you say antecedents, if I'm understanding this, what I think is presuppositions.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And so the presuppositions drive where you end up financially, much more than I used to do crisis financial counseling at our church. I don't have enough grace. I'm a little bit too harsh, apparently, for that particular exercise. But I've worked with people that had way too much debt, and you work with them over a few years, and you rescue them out of the miry pit of financial bondage.
Right.
For what? So now they live a materialistic middle class or upper middle class lifestyle, and they were able to enjoy some of the transient human pleasures.
But from an eternal perspective, they're no better off.
They're no better off. No, they're not at all.
That makes
As
sense.
opposed to rescuing somebody out of the miry pit, and then having them realize that God has called us as a follower of Jesus. The King of all kings has certain expectations for me, and I may not be happy to be in certain places where I believe God has led my wife and I. But wow, the joy unspeakable to be about the King's business and advancing His agenda.
Yeah, I'm teaching right now at church that grace is the desire and ability to do what pleases God.
Correct.
In addition, in furthering the idea that you're saved by grace through faith, there's no works involved in that. Jesus did it all. But then going forward, that's what He wants to do is our presuppositions infuse us with His grace, humility, and faith. And so we can do. It's freedom. We're talking about freedom and statism as opposed, and I would say freedom and slavery. That's exactly what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Not in money terms necessarily, but freedom is the ability to do what you want to do and it be the right thing.
That's right.
That's heaven.
It was Jonathan Edwards has this old sermon on the explosive power of a new affection.
Yeah.
If you rescue somebody out of materialism is terrible in America at the moment and devastating.
And when I say materialism, I'm thinking about a worldview that nothing exists except matter.
Right.
You're not talking about that necessarily, I don't think.
Well, that is the antecedent or the presupposition to all that really matters is making sure that I have a better house than you. And so there's a much better way to live a fulfilled life. But let me address one issue just because a thought crossed my mind. There's something out there known as the prosperity gospel that if you become a follower of Jesus Christ, that you'll somehow be healthy, wealthy, and wise. Well, if you spend time in the Bible as a follower of Jesus, you will become wiser. But Jesus promised that suffering is in your future.
Sure.
You don't necessarily become healthy and wealthy. But if we're designed to be fighters, basically, humans are in some sense, there is good, there is evil, and there's a war on, so to speak. And so if we're designed to be engaged in advancing God's kingdom, then it shouldn't be a surprise that if we're not doing that, we're ultimately unhappy.
And if you're talking about suffering in terms of financial, it's pretty much biting the bullet sometimes. But if you're not a Christian, if you're not a believer, you're still going to suffer. But you spend your life trying to escape it.
Right.
Everything, all your resources are pushed into trying to escape that. And there's some, okay, yeah, sure, so am I, kind of thing. I don't want to dive into it, but if I do have it, if I suffer in some way, there's a remedy for that, or a grace to go through that, and an end result of it as well. Ultimately, heaven. I mean, we promise that ultimately there is no suffering.
Right, and the eternal rewards. I mean, often just look at what happened to the original apostles, and some of the early church leaders. They were executed because they were followers of Jesus Christ. Well, if you were to ask them today, was it worth it? They would say yes. And so if in fact the Christian worldview is true, and I believe it is, factually, empirically, rationally, however you want to think about it, then we're eternal beings. And as an eternal being, interestingly, as an eternal being, I'm going to outlive the United States of America. So it's not surprising that I have certain inalienable rights that supersede the state. If atheistic Marxism is true and we're in a communist country, that worldview leads to the conclusion that the state is going to outlive you. And that changes everything. If you read the Declaration of Independence side by side to the preamble of the Communist Party Constitution, the Chinese Communist Party Constitution, that answers a lot of questions of the difference between America and China.
I want to go back to the idea of antecedents equals presuppositions equals worldviews. 2 Corinthians 10:4 and 5 is kind of one of the foundational passages of Scripture for Church for Skeptics, for what I've been doing for almost 20 years now, about 20 years. And it says that the weapons of our warfare are not fleshly, they're not physical, but they are mighty through the power of God to pulling down strongholds. Well, then the next verse talks about what those strongholds are. They are arguments and antecedents, presuppositions, worldviews that stand against the knowledge of God. If I'm an atheist, I can't be saved. I can't come to Christ, If I'm a Marxist, maybe, really, if you're a pure Marxist, that's the same thing. I'm an atheist, right?
You have to be.
Yeah, you'd have to be. So my point is that on another set of videos here, I'm trying to chip away a little bit and get people to wonder about evolution as a presupposition that stands against the knowledge of God. We're just animals. You've said that several times. Well, I think Marxism is another stronghold that seems to be gaining ascendancy in our culture. Is that another stronghold that we need to go after?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think of the teenage boy that was rebelling against their parents, and so he joined the Marines. And so what I find fascinating is students on university campuses today find Marxism deeply attractive. Right. Why do they find it attractive? Well, it's not fair that somebody like me has more wealth than somebody like them, and so they want to redistribute that wealth out of my pocket into their pocket. What I find so stunningly foolish about Marxism is it's attractive to people because they want to rebel against the rich people in their culture, so to speak. And so what do they get in return? They get a tyrant. They get an authoritarian, ruthless ruler who imprisons millions of people and enslaves them. And
it starts with the promise of liberty.
That's exactly right. And so it's like the teenage boy who gets promised that you'll have all this, you'll be able to go around the world and enjoy all these things if you join the Marines.
Now do 100 push-ups.
That's exactly right. And so one interesting anecdote is my wife and I have gone into communist countries in the past, long before COVID, and we were instructed to bring U.S. based made N95 masks. Why? Because the pollution was so bad. And so it's fascinating to me with many internationals that come to our country from closed countries or countries that are hostile to Christianity. One of the things that blows them away is the appearance of stars in the sky. They've never seen them before.
Oh my goodness!
Because they've lived in polluted cities. And so my Marxist students think if only we could have, everybody get on board with global climate change and have kind of this all one government and let's mandate all these kind of things. What they don't realize is they're going to end up living in a highly polluted, very difficult to live in culture. Whereas people that have liberty generally, not perfectly because we're humans, the outcome is much better.
All right, I got two major questions here. One is the word equity. It's throughout Scripture. I'm reading Proverbs today. I hear a lot about equity there, and we hear a lot about equity in our current culture. And what you said is that students, they embrace Marxism because it seems like it's more equitable. So I want to know if there's a difference between biblical equity and Marxist equity, and what's the difference?
Well, Marxist equity alleged goal is equal outcomes. Is that we all have the same. You can't be making twice as much money as I am, or we have sort of this equal outcomes. Biblically,
did that ever happen in any culture?
Oh, absolutely not. I saw more Lamborghinis and Porsches and Audis in the capital of a closed country than anywhere else in the world that I've ever seen.
Wow.
And so what ends up happening is you talk about what the wealth gap in America, like the top 1% or something. In closed countries, that top 1% owns everything. And so, but they got there by claiming we're going to share everything.
Right.
And it never has worked out that way.
in Stalinist Russia, the Communist Party members drove separate roads.
Yeah.
They had separate roads
Yeah.
to ride, so they didn't have to fight traffic.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Here's my second question.
Yeah, hang on a
Go
minute.
ahead. No, go ahead.
And so, actually, I lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I want to hear your, because I think you covered the equal outcome idea.
All right. So,
What's the Christian view of equity?
well, God did not create us all equal.
Right.
You know, if
No.
I'm 7'3" and I have a genetic strand of coordination, basketball might be appealing.
Yeah.
I'm a tall person, but I have no coordination, and so
I've noticed that about your arm.
yeah, so I'm clumsy, and so we are not all created equal in our capacity to do things. I can do math. I enjoy doing complicated math for a living, and can do that all day and really enjoy it. Most people would find that deeply troubling, and so. In some sense, it's not surprising to me that I tend to get up early. I start work at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and at the moment I'm working 3 or 4 different jobs because I love what I do, and I love what God has, the doors God has opened for me in what I do. And well, it's not surprising that the wealth level of my family is a little bit different than the person who just doesn't feel like working at all. What I find amazing is typically the people, laziness, I don't know how to cure in a student. If a student is lazy, I've actually got nothing I can do to help that student.
I think hunger is the
That
biblical
that
solution.
But I mean, it's just not possible. And what I find amazing is that the lazy person, I believe, ends up working a whole lot harder than anybody else.
Oh, yes.
Right,
Yes.
because-
Cramming for a test the night before.
That's exactly right. And all through life, if you're lazy, you're going to like take on more debt than you should, and all these other things. And then you have these health consequences that if you treat your body the way God did not intend for you to treat your body, it's not surprising that you have consequences. And I mean, the fact that we're all sinful, we all do have consequences, and but we can make it worse based on our own choices. And so basically you can take a highly productive, inspired, somebody who has a deep sense of God's call in business, and you can basically drop them in a jungle with nothing. And the next thing you know, they're going to be running the jungle.
Okay.
Because-
That makes
Right.
sense.
And my question to you is, who do you want running the business when you go to eat at a fast food restaurant? Do you want the people that are running that business to view you as a divine creation of God, worthy of very clean, well-cooked food with a lot of thought to make sure it's safe and delivered in a pleasant environment? Or do you want somebody who's just minimally complying with whatever the laws happen to be? I think most atheists, particularly in the area of wealth management, I've worked for some devout atheists, but they want me working for them because I'm going to do a day's work for a day's pay and not take a bribe because I believe in a God.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's fascinating to me how in finance your worldview just works itself out. It reveals itself.
And one of the questions here we haven't really covered is it important for that finance professionals behave ethically? And even though, non-believers are all about ethics, they still embrace ethics. Well, for me, ethics is just equal to practical morality. I don't see the big difference between the two. They might say, though, there is no morality, but they want to be ethical. So what's the answer to that question, obviously?
Yeah.
I think,
Well, I would argue with my atheist friends that there are no ethics within your own worldview.
Right.
There's no good, there's no evil. We might come to a social contract that,
Right.
listen, I will behave in this way. But the problem in the finance area is your money ends up in my discretion.
Right.
No, so if I'm managing your retirement fund, I have discretion. Now, there's something I know about the finance industry is once you give me discretion, what you have to do, or else I can't really help you. There are very efficient ways to get the money out of your pocket into mine, and you never know it.
And it happens all the time.
It happens all the time. And so who would you rather have managing your money? Would you rather have somebody with a worldview who doesn't believe there's an evil or there's good, and that?
So they better survive the best they can. They're the fittest, so they have more.
Therefore, and you shouldn't have that money anyway.
Right.
It should be my money, and so anyway, it's not surprising to me that Christians tend to do well in aggregate, not every case, but in aggregate, in the area of managing money.
All right, probably last question here. I don't think we ever quite defined Christian equity, because it's, throughout through Scripture, and equity doesn't mean, apparently biblical equity doesn't mean equal outcome necessarily.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the New Testament church here, the early, in the book of Acts, where they divided everything. They brought, sold their land and brought the money to help other people. It feels a little bit like that was equitable, and we certainly don't do that in our churches today. So just address that. What is biblical equity? Was it present in the New Testament church in the book of Acts, and should we be doing that exactly today, or what's the difference?
Yeah, this is probably not the right venue to launch a new idea, but
I know it is. Maybe that's another video.
No. But I'd like to launch a new idea.
You can introduce the next video that we do this.
Yeah. So here's the big idea. For many of you watching this, you probably wouldn't do cocaine. Why won't you do cocaine? Because you realize it's highly addictive, and if you start it, you're going to go down a path that's deeply destructive. There are many people who don't drink alcohol. Because they know they're prone to that addiction, and it's going to lead to other things that will end up being destructive. I have the idea that one little handout, the government offering this one little benefit, just your family bailing you out this one little time is worse than cocaine. It's been my observation that people that have tasted the handout are addicted the rest of their life. So we need to develop not an Alcoholic Anonymous, not a Narcotics Anonymous, but a Materialism Anonymous, because the addiction to handouts. Now, there are legitimate cases of need.
Sure.
And that's not what I'm talking about here.
Right.
But there's something horribly addictive about handouts. And so generally, like when I used to do crisis financial counseling, the worst thing you can do, just think about this for a moment. What's the worst thing you can do for a drug addict? Is give them money.
Oh, yeah.
Giving a drug addict money is horrible because they're going to kill themselves.
Right.
Well, the worst thing you can do for somebody materialistically addicted is to give them a handout. But you can give them a job.
Right.
In other words, there's deep, from the Christian worldview, work is deeply fulfilling.
Oh, yeah.
The capacity, I can tell you story after story of people involved in creative thing. A guy named Craig Deal in Zimbabwe took basically $1 billion food deficit to $1 billion surplus based on biblically based farming.
Wow.
And there's just an enormous number of people doing amazingly creative things.
So should we be doing, what does that play into the book of Acts, the new, where they brought money into the church and distributed it, but it wasn't a handout, apparently. Really, it wasn't a handout. Now, of course, we have a lot of slaves in Jerusalem, too, being in the Christian community. So I'm sure there are cases where, handouts are not necessarily, you wouldn't say necessary, but certainly well-deserved in that sense. People have needs, like you said.
Yeah. So think of Afghanistan today.
Okay.
There are people being hunted down and killed because they're Christian. In that context.
It's now the number one place to be dangerous, according to all the statistics.
Yeah, so in countries that have Christians, our Christian brothers and sisters, fleeing for their lives, that's dynamically different than America. In today's environment, if you tell me I can't find a job, that
Just
tells
look at the
me
billboards.
You're not looking very hard,
Yeah.
or you have an aversion to work, and that aversion to work is in part the wrong worldview.
Right.
Because we are designed to work. We're created to be productive.
And even if you have, even if you have a job where you're you're not the boss,
Mm-hmm.
you still can be creative and use those energies that God's given you. You can be creative in whatever job you have for somebody else.
Absolutely, and in some sense, that's the life of a Christian.
Yeah.
I'm going to be creative to bring glory to God.
Yeah, good
and
point.
and so ultimately, in my case, where research, University of Alabama puts a lot of pressure on doing research, and there's just not that much emphasis on teaching. Well, I'm going to go in and teach to the best of my ability, which may not be very good, but I'm going to do the best I can, not so that my boss is pleased. I'm going to do the best I can so that the King of all kings is pleased. And the amazing thing to me is it ends up my boss is very pleased.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No doubt. Yeah.
And so if you work for an audience of one and realize there's no mere mortal that you ever encounter, everybody's an eternal being, and there's no mundane task. I mean, you can do some of the most mundane things to the glory of God, and it brings Him glory. And so in some sense, it's not surprising that Christians' perspective on how they operate in modern economies, we just have a tremendous advantage.
And we do have I think, a God-given desire to do better, be better. It's not like we want to be suffering or we want to be poor or we want to not, just struggle all the time. It's just that this world, and you have the fall, of man, and the world, in a sense, works against us. It gives us battles, and God gives us the ability to struggle through those profitably. But the end result of this is, Jesus died for our sins and rose again. And ultimately, if we embrace that and embrace Him, the end result will be, if you consider the path, ponder the path of your feet, your destination is determined by your path.
Yeah.
So
On that particular note, I'm involved with a company called Second Vote.
okay,
The first vote is what you do with your money. What you do with your vote at the ballot box. Your second vote is what you do with your money.
the most sensitive nerve is behind your brain down to your pocket.
That's exactly right. And so, as a follower of Jesus Christ, I think I should be sensitive to investing in companies that are contributing to the execution of the unborn. And so how can I invest in a stock portfolio if some of those companies are contributing to Planned Parenthood? Second Vote's objective is to bring sunlight to what companies are doing. And so I'd recommend you go to 2ND, the number 2, ndvote.com, and there's a sister company, Second Vote Advisors, where there's a couple of exchange-traded funds. One's LYFE, where we invest in companies that don't contribute to pro-choice causes. And so as within the Christian community, we need to do a better job of not supporting people that are deeply hostile to the Christian worldview. And so how we spend our money is very important to God, and I think we need to do a better job of making sure that we don't contribute to those sorts of causes. My atheist friends, through ESG investing and environmental, social, and governance investing, are doing a great job of promoting leftist causes by taking corporate dollars. Well, those corporate dollars ought to be going to shareholders. And so Second Vote's objective is to basically promote companies that are not trying to move our country in a direction that is actually destructive to our own human flourishing.
And maybe we can link websites with that.
Yeah, that would be great. The other thing is I do have a website, robertebrooks.org, where I put some of these foundational ideas under my personal interest tab.
Right.
And I would love feedback if you really don't like it, let me know, and let me know why, and maybe I can improve.
All right. Well, listen, it's been a great conversation. We could keep going, and hopefully will in the future. Okay. But thanks a lot for coming.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you again.